The Apache warrior had lived his life in silence, a man of the wild plains and the endless deserts, where wind carved its own language against the cliffs and rivers, spoke only to those who listened long enough. He was tall, lean, and scarred, not from age, but from a lifetime of battles that had etched their stories into his skin. Every line on his face was a memory of fire, loss, and survival. He was known among his people as a man who carried no family, no wife, and no longing for one. Solitude was his shield, and freedom was his only companion. Yet deep inside, beneath the armor of silence and pride, there was a wound that no battle had given him. It was the wound of emptiness. He had never spoken it aloud, but the truth clung to his heart. He had never had a wife, never known the warmth of a woman's steady gaze at dusk, nor the laughter of children waiting for his return. While other warriors carried stories of their loves and their losses, he carried only shadows. It was during one such evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, that he wandered to the creek that cut through the valley. The water shimmered in hues of gold and silver, and the trees bent low as if to whisper secrets into its flow. The Apache often came here, not for the water itself, but for the stillness. The creek gave him something the harsh mountains could not piece, a reminder that the world still carried softness. That night he was not alone. At first, he thought the shape near the water was an illusion, the kind of trick the dusk sometimes played on tired eyes. But as he drew nearer, he saw her clearly, a woman, kneeling by the water's edge, her hands busy with cloth that floated in the current. She was not of his people. Her dress spoke of the settlers who had pushed their way into these lands, yet she moved with a grace that silenced him. Her hair was unbound, catching light like threads of copper, and her face was soft but marked by weariness, the kind that spoke of struggle. The Apache did not step closer, not yet. Instead, he remained in the shadows of the trees, watching. He told himself it was caution, that her presence might bring danger. But deep within, he knew it was something else. He could not remember the last time he had looked at another human being and felt such a stirring. The woman hummed softly, a tune half lost to the night. It was not a song he knew, but its melody tugged at him. Her voice carried no fear, no sharpness, only a quiet strength that seemed to echo in the very rhythm of the creek. She had come alone, perhaps seeking the same stillness he always sought. For the first time in many years, the Apache warrior felt something shift inside him. He had always believed the land belonged only to those strong enough to walk it alone. But now, as he stood watching this woman by the water, he felt the truth tremble within him. Solitude had been his choice. Yes, but maybe it had also been his prison. The creek ran steady between them, but their eyes met when she lifted her head. In that brief glance, she did not flinch, did not look away. She did not see him as a shadow in the trees, nor as a threat with a warrior's stance. She saw him simply as a man, and in her gaze he felt a question rise, one that had no words. A question about belonging. A question about love. The Apache told himself he would turn and leave, vanish back into the safety of solitude. Yet he did not move. Something in her eyes held him, rooted him more firmly than any battle ever had. He whispered in his heart words he had never dared speak aloud. I never had a wife, and for the first time, he wondered if fate had brought him here, to this creek, to the woman whose eyes carried the warmth he had been denied his entire life. The woman by the creek had long since grown accustomed to silence. Life on the frontier was unforgiving, and the silence of the wild was often her only companion. Once she had known laughter, a warm home, and a man's hand that had promised protection. But that life had ended too soon. Her husband, a settler trying to tame the untamable land, had been taken by fever in the dead of winter. Since then, she had carried grief not as a wound but as a burden she bore daily. When she came to the creek each evening, she did not come only to wash her clothes or fetch water. She came for something deeper, a chance to feel alive, even if only in the sound of the rushing current or the coolness of the stones beneath her feet. The water's endless journey reminded her that even broken lives could flow forward. On this evening, the woman felt a strange awareness prickling at her skin. She could not explain why, but as she knelt by the water, wringing fabric with tired hands, she sensed eyes upon her. The wild was never safe. She had always known that. Yet, for some reason, she did not feel afraid. Instead, she felt watched in a way that was gentle, almost protective. She lifted her head, brushing strands of loose hair from her face, and her gaze caught something in the tree line. A figure, still and silent, half swallowed by the shadows. At first, her heart leapt with alarm, but then she saw him clearly, an Apache warrior. His stance was strong, his expression unreadable, but his eyes did not carry threat. They carried something else, something she could not name. Every tale she had heard from settlers painted the Apache as fierce, merciless, untamed. But this man did not move like a predator. He did not draw his weapon nor rush forward with anger. He stood as though uncertain, perhaps even curious. She realized with a strange calm that he was studying her just as she studied him, her fingers stilled on the fabric in her hands. For a long breath, they simply looked at one another across the divide of the creek. She could not explain the pull she felt in that moment, as though some unseen cord tied her heart to his. The woman had spent months with only her own thoughts for company. Loneliness had carved her sharper than grief itself. And now, standing before her, was a man who seemed to carry the same solitude she did. His eyes were not cruel, they were heavy, like someone who bore the same weight of loss she knew too well when the moment grew too heavy. She lowered her gaze and returned to her washing, pretending she had not seen him. But she could still feel the intensity of his presence. The creek's water splashed gently over the rocks, filling the silence between them with its steady rhythm. She thought he would vanish, slip away like a ghost of the wild. Yet when she glanced back, he was still there, watching, unmoving. And in a way she could not explain, she felt safer knowing he remained. Perhaps it was madness to think this way, she told herself. This man was Apache. His world was different, his life bound by laws and traditions she could never understand. And yet, in his stillness, she recognized something she had not felt in a long time: recognition. It was as though he saw her not as a settler, not as an intruder, but as a woman. Her heart stirred uneasily. She told herself to leave, to return home before darkness deepened. Yet she lingered. Some part of her, aching and tired of endless solitude, wanted to stay in this strange moment, this fragile thread of connection woven by nothing more than a glance. The woman rose slowly, gathering her damp clothes. She offered no words, for she doubted he would understand. But she allowed herself one last glance at him before she turned away. His eyes did not follow her with threat, but with something far softer, something that warmed her in the cool night air. As she walked home, her steps felt lighter than they had in months. She had not spoken, yet she had been seen. And deep in her heart, she wondered if fate had brought her to the creek not to wash away her loneliness, but to meet the man whose silence spoke louder than any words. For many evenings, the creek had been his alone, a place of quiet exchange, of glances and gestures that grew into something deeper. But in the wilderness, nothing remained untouched for long. The world beyond their sanctuary had sharp eyes and sharper tongues, and soon whispers began to stir. The woman first sensed it among her own people. One morning, as she traded flour at a small settlement store, she caught the looks. Two women whispered together, their eyes cutting toward her before lowering quickly. A man with a rifle leaned against the post, shaking his head with disapproval. At first, she thought little of it. Widowhood already carried a weight of suspicion. A woman living alone was often judged for her independence. But then she heard one of them mutter words that chilled her blood. Seen her down by the creek. Not always alone. Her hands tightened around the small sack of flour. They had seen. Somehow, someone had noticed her silent meetings with the Apache. That evening, as she made her way to the creek, unease coiled inside her. She half expected him not to be there, half wished he would not come. Yet when she arrived, he was already waiting in the shadows, his presence steady, his gaze calm. The sight of him eased her, yet fear clung close. Across the water, she shook her head faintly, as if warning him. He noticed, of course he noticed everything. His brows drew together, and he took a cautious step forward. They saw us, she whispered, though she knew he could not fully understand her words. Still, the tremor in her voice carried enough meaning. His jaw tightened. He had expected this day to come. Among his people, too, there had been murmurs. A warrior lingering too often by the creek, leaving offerings for a settler woman, it was not overlooked. One elder had warned him, sharp with disapproval. The eyes of the tribe see everything. Do not lose yourself to her kind, but how could he stay away? Each evening he tried, his feet betrayed him, carrying him back to the water where she waited. He had not chosen this bond, it had chosen him. And now it was being tested. The threat did not remain whispers for long. Days later, as the woman returned from the creek, a settler man rode to her cabin. He dismounted, his face twisted with disdain. "You think we don't know?" He spat. "You sit by the water like a wife waiting for her man. But he ain't your man. He's Apache, savage." She stood tall, though fear shook inside her. "You don't know what you speak of," she said softly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. The man's eyes narrowed. "Keep meeting him, and you'll bring trouble to all of us. They'll come for him, and they'll come for you too. Is that what you want?" He left her with those words heavy in the air, dust rising behind his horse as he rode away. She sank onto her porch, her hands trembling. The world would not allow her heart its peace. When she met the Apache again, her eyes carried the weight of those warnings. He studied her, silent, waiting. Finally, she shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "They will not let us." She began, but her voice broke. The warrior's face remained still, but his heart thundered. He knew well the truth in her words. Both their worlds would rise against this fragile bond. Yet, as he looked at her across the creek, he felt something stronger than fear, resolve. His people had taken everything from him but his solitude. Now, this woman had given him something he never thought he would know belonging. And though danger loomed, though whispers sharpened into threats, he knew one thing with certainty. He would not turn away. The creek was no longer just water. It was a boundary between two worlds, and they stood on either side, daring to meet in the middle. But boundaries, like water, could shift, and in the eyes of the woman who refused to look away, he found the courage to face whatever storm was coming. The days that followed were heavy with unease. The woman carried the settler's warnings like stones in her chest, while the Apache carried his people's disapproval like a shadow on his back. Yet neither could stay away. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges and the sky bled into twilight, their paths led them to the creek, as though the water itself called them. That evening the air was different. The forest was hushed, the creek's song lower, quieter, as if it too was listening. The Apache stood on one side, the woman on the other, both carrying unspoken fears. She knelt slowly, setting down her basket, her hands trembling. He stepped closer to the water than he ever had before. For a long time, they simply looked at each other. The weight of silence was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. She could see in his eyes that he wanted to speak, though words did not come easily to him. And she, though her heart longed to say what it felt, feared the danger that truth would bring. Finally, he broke. His voice, deep and unpolished, carried across the water like the roll of distant thunder. "I never had a wife." The words hung in the air, heavy, raw. His eyes did not leave hers, though his heart pounded against his ribs. He had said it before, once in a slip of confession, but this time it was different. This time it was not a statement of loneliness, it was an offering. A piece of his soul laid bare before her, her breath caught. She understood not every word, perhaps, but the meaning. She saw the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his chest rose as if bracing for rejection. He was giving her truth, and truth demanded courage. Her lips parted, and though her voice trembled, it was steady enough to answer. "My husband? He is gone." She swallowed, her eyes lowering to the water before lifting again. "I thought I would never—" Her words faltered, tears filling her eyes. "Never love again." The Apache felt the ache of her loss as if it were his own. In her brokenness he saw his emptiness. Two lives carved hollow by grief, now standing at the edge of something neither had dared hope for. He stepped closer, so close the creek lapped at his boots. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand. His fingers trembled not from fear of her, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He extended it across the water, palm open, an unspoken request. The woman's eyes widened. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, fear whispering of the risks, of the dangers. But then her gaze dropped to his hand, roughened by war and wilderness, and she understood. This was not a hand that sought to claim or conquer. This was a hand that sought connection. With tears blurring her vision, she reached out. Her fingers brushed his, light as the touch of a feather. The contact was brief, trembling, but it was enough. In that moment, the world stilled. The creek sang louder, the air grew warmer, and the loneliness that had haunted them both began to melt. The Apache drew in a sharp breath. No battle had ever undone him the way her touch did. No wound had ever cut so deeply, and no bomb had ever healed so swiftly. When she pulled her hand back, her eyes shimmered with something unspoken, something that frightened her, but also gave her strength. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I see you." He did not know the words, but he knew the meaning. He saw it in her gaze, in the trembling of her lips, in the way her heart seemed to reach across the water. That night, the warrior who had once believed silence was his only companion walked away knowing he had spoken the truest words of his life. And the woman who thought her heart had died with her husband found it beating again fast, fierce and alive by the creek, beneath the fading light. Two souls had confessed not with vows or promises, but with simple truths, and in those truths love had begun to take root. The days after their confession at the water's edge felt different, as if the air itself carried a quiet blessing. The woman no longer came to the creek only for water or chores, she came to meet him. And the Apache no longer lingered in the shadows, pretending his path had merely wandered there. He came because his heart demanded it. They still spoke little, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy with unspoken fears, but alive with possibility. Every glance, every hesitant smile, every small gesture carried meaning deeper than words. Yet the warrior knew that meaning must one day be given shape. His people taught him that promises were not made with careless lips, but with action, with gifts forged by the land itself. So he set to work. For 3 nights, under the glow of firelight, he gathered smooth stones from the creek, each one chosen for its shape, its shine, its weight. With careful patience, he drilled holes through them, stringing them together with sinew until they formed a simple necklace. It was not adorned with silver or beads, not like the settler's trinkets, but it was made by his own hands, shaped by his own devotion. To him, it was more sacred than any ring. When next they met by the creek, the woman noticed something in his eyes, an intent she had not seen before. He stood taller, as though carrying the gravity of a decision. Slowly he approached, his hand closed around something hidden. Her heart quickened. She rose from the stones, uncertain, her breath caught between fear and anticipation. The Apache stopped just at the edge of the water, and when he opened his hand, the necklace lay across his palm. The smooth stones gleamed faintly in the fading light, each one worn by the touch of the creek they both loved. Her eyes widened. She understood at once. This was no mere gift. It was a promise. He lifted the necklace, stepping into the shallow water to close the distance between them. She hesitated only a moment before moving forward, too, until the current lapped gently around their ankles. With deliberate care, he placed the necklace around her neck. His fingers brushed her skin, sending a shiver through her. His eyes met hers, unflinching, steady as stone. When he spoke, his voice was low, reverent. Not wife. Promise. The words were few, broken by the limits of their languages, but she understood. This was his vow, not yet a claim, but a pledge. A vow to remain, to choose her, to protect the fragile bond they had found. Her hand lifted to the necklace, trembling as she touched the smooth stones. They were cool against her skin, but they burned with the weight of meaning. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sorrow, but of something she had thought lost to her forever hope. For a long moment, neither moved. The creek sang around them, the water reflecting the fading light like liquid fire. Then, with a courage born from her heart's own awakening, she reached into her basket. From it, she drew a piece of cloth she had kept for months, an old kerchief of her late husband's, faded but carefully mended. She held it out to the Apache, her hands trembling. He looked at it, then at her, his eyes questioning. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. Promise. She pressed the cloth into his hand. It was not grand, not valuable, but it was what she had. It was a part of her past, now entrusted to him as part of her future. The Apache closed his hand around it, his chest tightening with emotion. He understood. She had accepted his vow, and in return, given her own. The two stood there, in the shallows of the creek, bound not by words or traditions, but by gifts born of their live stones from the land he loved, cloth from the life she had lost. In that moment, they were no longer just a warrior and a widow. They were two souls who had chosen each other, defying every boundary between them. And with the necklace resting against her heart and the cloth pressed into his palm, a sacred promise had been sealed. The sacred promise by the creek bound them together in ways words could never capture. The necklace of stones rested against her heart, a quiet reminder of the Apache's vow. The piece of cloth she had given him, once her husband's, now lay folded inside his pouch, guarded as carefully as his knife. Yet promises, however sacred, could not protect them from the eyes of the world. The whispers had grown sharper. Settlers muttered her name when she walked past, their tones carrying suspicion and disdain. A widow's grief had once won her pity. Now her presence at the creek made her an outcast. She heard their warnings in the market, disguised as advice. Stay away from the water at dusk. Don't forget what they are capable of. The words stung, but not as much as the coldness in their eyes. The Apache, too, faced trials among his people. His tribe saw his absence during hunting hours, his long silences when the elders spoke. One warrior spat at his feet, calling him a fool for lingering near the settlers. Another warned that the woman would betray him the moment it served her. Yet the Apache did not waver. For every insult, for every suspicion cast upon him, he carried her memory like armor. Still, the trials pressed in from all sides. One evening, as the woman walked home from the creek, two settlers blocked her path. Their faces were hard, their voices cruel. You think you can make friends with them? One sneered. It'll get you killed, and it'll bring them down on the rest of us. Fear gripped her. But before she could answer, a shadow emerged from the trees. The Apache stepped forward, silent, but his presence was thunder. The men stiffened, hands twitching near their rifles. For a moment, violence seemed certain, but then the warrior did something unexpected. He reached into his pouch, pulled out the folded cloth she had given him, and held it up. His eyes locked with hers, steady, unyielding. It was not a weapon he showed, but a bond of vow. The settlers sneered, muttered curses, and finally stepped aside, their boots crunching angrily on the dirt road as they left. The woman stood trembling, her breath uneven, but her heart steadier than ever. He had not spoken, had not fought, yet his message had been clear: I will stand beside you. Even in the face of danger. Their bond, however, carried a cost. The woman soon found herself more isolated than before, neighbors refusing to trade or speak with her. The Apache, too, bore the weight of disapproval, some of his kin watching him with eyes colder than stone. Both knew they were walking a dangerous path, one that could end in ruin, yet each trial only deepened their bond. When she knelt by the creek, he was there. When he hunted, he brought her food. When loneliness pressed hard, they met in silence that soothed instead of burned. Together, they created a sanctuary in the heart of the wild, a place untouched by judgment, where only the water bore witness to their growing love. But trials are relentless. One evening, as the sky darkened and the creek shimmered under moonlight, she turned to him, her eyes shining with both fear and defiance. "They will not stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They will try to tear us apart." The Apache did not look away. He stepped forward, his hand brushing against the necklace of stones resting on her chest. His voice was low, steady as the earth itself. Promise. Strong. Her eyes filled with tears. She placed her hand over his, pressing it against the necklace. Yes, she breathed. Strong. Trials would come, more bitter and dangerous than whispers or stares. But in that moment, they knew one truth. Their love was no fragile flame. It was a fire kindled by the wild, unyielding to storm or shadow. And though the world around them tried to break them, their bond only grew stronger, tested and tempered like steel and flame. The Apache warrior had always believed that silence was safer than words. Words could be twisted, broken, misunderstood. Silence, however, carried its own strength. It allowed him to remain untouchable, a shadow in the wilderness, a man who needed no one. But the woman by the creek had begun to unravel that shield without speaking a single word. For days, he watched her. At first, he told himself it was caution. She was a settler, and settlers often brought trouble. Yet with each visit, he found himself drawn closer, as though some invisible pull guided his steps to the water's edge. She came at the same time each evening, always with her basket, always with her quiet hum that blended with the music of the flowing creek. He noticed the way her hands worked quickly, yet delicately, smoothing cloth as though it were precious. He noticed the faint sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. He noticed, too, how she did not shy from his gaze when their eyes met across the current. Unlike others who feared him or looked at him with suspicion, she met his stare with calm curiosity, as though she had long expected him to appear. One evening, as the sun fell low and painted the sky in fire, he stepped closer than he had before. The woman stiffened, but she did not flee. Her eyes lifted, cautious yet steady. The air between them thickened, filled with the beating of two hearts, both equally uncertain. The Apache's throat tightened. It had been years since he had spoken to a stranger, years since he had let his voice carry words beyond the necessary commands of survival. His tongue felt heavy, his breath caught. But something in the softness of her gaze gave him courage. At last he spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel breaking the silence. I never had a wife." The words startled even him. He had not meant to confess this truth, not to her, not to anyone. Yet they had slipped out, raw and unguarded, carrying with them all the loneliness he had buried for so long. The woman blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. He doubted she understood all his words, but something in his tone, in the weight behind them, made her pause. She set her basket aside and slowly straightened, as though drawn by the gravity of what he had said. For a long heartbeat, they stood there, warrior and widow-bound by silence once more. Then, almost timidly, she spoke. Her voice was soft, the edges worn by loss. "I had a husband. Once." Though her accent shaped the words differently than his tongue, he understood. The way her eyes dimmed as she said them told the story better than language ever could. A strange ache tightened in his chest. In her, he saw the reflection of his own solitude, his own hollow nights. She had known love and lost it. He had never known it at all. Yet somehow, standing by the creek, they met in the same place, two hearts carrying emptiness, now brushing against the possibility of being filled. The Apache lowered his gaze for a moment, then lifted it again, braver this time. His hand twitched at his side as though tempted to reach out. He did not. Still, his eyes spoke the words he could not yet form. "I see you. I understand." The woman's lips curved faintly, not a smile, not yet, but the beginning of one. It was the first spark of warmth he had seen in her since their silent encounters began. The creek's song filled the spaces between them, gentle and steady. The warrior felt as though the land itself had witnessed their first words and blessed them. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like a shadow. For the first time, he felt seen. And in that fragile exchange, a door opened. He did not know what lay beyond it, but he knew this. Silence would no longer be enough. Words had found him, and with them, a chance at something he had once thought impossible. After their first words, the Apache warrior and the woman by the creek discovered something unusual, that words were not the only way to speak. In truth, words often failed them. His tongue carried the cadence of his people. Hers was heavy with the settler's language. Their voices were separated by culture, by years of mistrust between their worlds. But the creek became their bridge. Day after day, they met again, sometimes with a glance, sometimes with a gesture. At first, neither dared to step too close. The woman continued her washing, kneeling on the smooth stones as she always did. The Apache stood across from her, a silent sentinel in the shadows of the trees. Yet slowly the distance narrowed. Each evening he drew a little closer to the water's edge, and each evening she let him. Their silences became layered, rich with meaning. When he knelt to refill his water skin, he would glance at her hands, working carefully in the current. She would glance back, holding his gaze for only a moment before lowering her eyes, a faint warmth on her cheeks. That unspoken exchange was enough to keep them tethered together until the next meeting. One evening, he brought with him a small offering, a piece of dried venison wrapped in hide. He laid it on the rock beside the creek, not crossing the water, but placing it where the stream's edge could carry the scent toward her. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes widening with surprise. For a moment, she hesitated. But then, with careful hands, she reached forward and took it. She nodded once, a simple movement, but one that spoke of gratitude. He nodded back, his lips pressing into what might have been the faintest of smiles. Another evening, she responded. As she knelt by the creek, she left a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth on the rocks. It was humble, unevenly baked, but the gesture was clear. When he accepted it, her heart lifted with a quiet thrill she had not felt in years. Neither spoke much, yet they spoke constantly in their silence. The way he stood, never turning his back on her, told her he was offering his protection. The way she lingered at the creek long after her work was finished told him she was choosing his company. Their eyes carried questions, their nods carried answers. Their faint gestures wove a language only the two of them could understand. The Apache began to notice details he had once ignored, the curve of her smile when her hands brushed the cool water, the way her hair caught the fading light, the soft sound of her hum that blended with the rustling leaves. These were things he had never thought he would care for, yet now they became the rhythm of his evenings. The woman, in turn, found herself studying him with new eyes. She saw the strength in his shoulders, the patience in his stillness, the scars that marked not cruelty but survival. She wondered what stories lived in those scars, though she never asked. Somehow she felt she already knew. The world beyond the creek remained dangerous. Settlers and Apache did not meet without suspicion, without blood. But here, by the water, those barriers seemed to dissolve. They were not settler and warrior, not enemies or strangers. They were simply man and woman, sharing silence that spoke louder than words. One evening, as twilight deepened, their eyes met and held longer than before. Neither looked away. In that gaze, he told her without sound, "I see you. You are not alone." And in her eyes, she answered, "Nor are you." The creek flowed on, carrying their unspoken promises with it. And though no vows had been spoken, no hands had touched, a bond had already begun to form, fragile, steady, and stronger than either of them had ever imagined. The creek had become their secret altar, a place where time slowed and the world's cruelties lost their grip. It was there the woman found her strength returning. She had once lived as though drifting, carried by sorrow's current after her husband's death. But now, every day she chose to walk toward the water, chose to see the Apache waiting, chose to let her heart stay where it longed to be at first. Her heart had resisted, beating with fear, whispering warnings of betrayal, of pain. But each time she met his steady eyes, each time she felt the warmth of his presence, that fear lessened. She realized love was not the lightning strike of passion, nor the sudden blaze of desire. Love was what remained when one decided not to run anymore. The Apache understood this too, though his understanding came in silence rather than words. For years he had lived as the wind lives, restless, belonging nowhere, tied to no promise. But when he tied the necklace around her neck, he tethered himself as well. He had found something he did not wish to leave, and that was a revelation deeper than any battle or hunt. One afternoon, as the sun laid gold across the water, she asked him the question that had been quietly burning inside her. "Why me?" Her voice was soft, tinged with disbelief. She had no beauty left, she thought, beyond the weary lines of grief. Her hands were rough from labor, her clothes plain, her spirit scarred. The Apache tilted his head, his brow furrowing as he searched for words. Language was a barrier, but the heart often spoke more clearly. Slowly, he placed his hand over his chest, then reached out and touched the necklace at her throat. His lips formed the words with careful weight. "Eyes." "Stay," she blinked, unsure. "My eyes?" He nodded, his gaze unflinching. "Others." "Look, then go. You. Stay." The meaning struck her with unexpected force. He was not speaking of her outward beauty, nor of her skill or station. He was speaking of constancy, of how she had looked at him without flinching, without turning away even when the world demanded it. Her eyes had not fled from his scars, his silence, his difference. She had stayed, and in that staying, she had given him something no one else had. Her throat tightened, tears gathering as she reached for his hand. "Then I'll keep staying," she whispered, voice trembling with a vow of its own. The Apache squeezed her hand, his silence more powerful than any speech. Yet staying was not only a choice for moments of peace. It meant enduring the storm. It meant holding on when doubt pressed in, when neighbors turned their backs, when his tribe questioned his loyalty. It meant staying even when leaving would have been easier. That night, as she lay in her small cabin, listening to the creek's faint murmur in the distance, she realized her heart had shifted. It no longer clung to the memory of the man she had buried, nor shrank from the judgment of others. Her heart had found a new home, not in safety or acceptance, but in a warrior who had given her his vow with nothing but stones and silence. And the Apache, lying beneath the stars on the edge of the forest, fingered the warm cloth she had given him. For the first time in his wandering life, he felt no urge to rise and walk into the horizon. He had found a reason to stay. Their hearts, once fugitives, had learned the most difficult lesson of all, that love is not about leaving when it hurts, but about staying even when the world does not understand. The creek flowed as it always had, timeless and unchanging, its waters carrying whispers of the land long before either of them had come to its banks. Yet for the Apache warrior and the widow, the creek was no longer just a stream, it was the witness of their love, the place where two broken lives had been mended and bound together. Seasons shifted. The air that had once been heavy with summer heat grew sharp with autumn's breath. Leaves browned and fell, carpeting the earth in a quilt of change. But though the world around them altered, the bond they had forged only deepened. The necklace of stones never left her neck, resting like a heartbeat over her chest. The folded cloth remained in his pouch, worn and frayed from being touched often, a constant reminder of her promise. Yet with every season came trials. There were nights when she wept quietly, overwhelmed by the whispers of townsfolk who had turned their faces away. There were days when his tribe pressed harder, questioning his choices, urging him to return fully to the old ways and abandon her. But neither wavered. When she faltered, his steady hand was there. When he doubted, her eyes met his, never leaving, always staying. One winter evening, snow powdered the banks of the creek, the water dark and swift beneath the frozen air. She stood shivering, wrapped in a thin shawl, waiting for him. When he appeared from the woods, carrying wood for her fire, her heart swelled with the quiet truth she had finally accepted. Love was not grand gestures or fleeting passion. It was the daily act of choosing each other, again and again. Even when it was hard. As he laid the wood at her feet, she reached out, pulling him closer. Her lips trembled, but her voice was firm. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have again," she whispered. "I thought I was finished, that my life was only grief. But you've given me life back." The Apache looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, the weight of his heart carried in every syllable. Before, no wife, no home. His voice softened, breaking like the creek against stone. Now, you home. Her tears fell, not of sadness but of joy too profound for silence. She leaned against him, her cheek pressed to the warmth of his chest, and felt the steady rhythm of his heart, the same rhythm that had once felt so distant, so untouchable, now beating in time with hers. The creek murmured beside them, carrying their vow into eternity. In the years to come, their lives would not be easy. They would still face suspicion, still walk paths shadowed by disapproval. But they had learned something greater than fear, that love did not need the world's blessing. Love needed only two hearts willing to stay, to endure, to promise, and to keep promising. And so, the Apache warrior who once said, "I never had a wife," no longer spoke those words. For though no priest had blessed their union, though no ceremony had bound them, he knew the truth. In the eyes of the woman by the creek, he had found not just a wife, but a partner of soul and spirit. The widow, too, no longer carried the title that had chained her to sorrow. She was no longer the woman left behind, no longer just a shadow of love lost. She was the woman chosen, cherished, and seen her heart reborn in the gaze of a man who had once belonged to no one. but now belonged to her dot, and through every season, through storm and silence alike, the creek flowed on eternal, unyielding, and constant, just like their love.